The person problem. If we ask how the term hypostasis was ever changed to person, which it never meant, we learn its genesis is uniquely Christian. Person is nowhere found in the Bible, New or Old Testaments, Hebrew or Greek, nor is it found anywhere in Greek philosophy. All we know is that it came from the particular use of persona found in Roman law. It is said the Latin Father's translation of the Greek hypostasis meant substance, the Platonic understanding of essence, which would not do to express the triune modes of God's existence. Since God is not three substances or three essences, the Latins decided to come up with a different term to express the Trinity. This Latin excuse, however, is problematic. First of all, etymologically hypostasis, understand or stand under, means the same as substance, understand or stand under. Secondly, since Roman Stoicism was the going religion of the day, both the Latins and Greeks knew the Stoic background of Origen's use of the term hypostasis, so who cares what Plato would have thought of hypostasis or substance? Since usage governs meaning, there is no excuse why the Latins did not adopt the Greeks' use of hypostasis. After all, the meaning of hypostasis was no clearer to the Greeks than it was for the Latins. As it turns out, of course, the Latins rejected hypostasis as an expression for the triune distinctions of God's singular essence. African-born Tertullian, 160 to 225, before his conversion to Christianity, had been a scholar of Roman law and, most likely, a Stoic as well. In Roman law, substance meant property as when speaking of a man of substance, thus substance referred to what a man possessed or owned. So, in the law, persona, person in English, was the legal reference to ownership, something an individual owned, a piece of property that belonged to him and to no other, such as a slave, money, land, etc. A person, then, is something an individual has, possesses, or owns. Person does not refer to what one is, in essence, does not refer to being or to what an individual being is. It is important, then, to keep in mind, individual refers to what one is, while a person only refers to what an individual owns or possesses. It is because a slave owned nothing, he was someone else's property, whereas, in truth, he was a slave because he was someone else's property. Thus, for example, Nero owned slaves, among other things, thus he was a person, whereas slaves, because they owned nothing, were not persons, did not own themselves. Slaves were regarded as human, but not persons. But putting person aside, all human beings are what they are, yet this is not who they are. So, what an individual human being is what he is and not what he owns, which is first and foremost, his own person. So, a person, then, is who one is, and not what one is. As this understanding of person was used in the West, by the Latins, to define the Trinity, God's one nature owns three distinct properties, which properties are God's persons, namely, Father, Son, Spirit. These three persons do not, however, refer to the nature or essence of God, but only to what God owns or possesses. Just as a human being is not what he owns, but what he is, so too, God is not what God owns, but what God is. This means God is the owner of a Trinity, three persons, but is not itself, in essence, a Trinity. So right off, the term person has to be rejected. It does not define the Trinity or align with the purpose for which it was defined as three hypostases, namely, the three distinct modes of God's existence. God does not own a Trinity, God is a Trinity. While the term persons makes no distinction in God's essence, it does, however, make a distinction between God's essence and God's persons, or properties. Thus, in essence, three persons is not what God is, but only what God owns. So, God owns three persons, Father, Son, Spirit, but God is not in essence three persons. This use of the Latin's persona was rejected outright by the Greeks. For them, persona meant a mask such as actors wear in Greek dramas, one individual playing several roles and switching masks accordingly. The Trinity, of course, was not three different masks or roles God was playing. This idea is even worse than modalism. So, the next term suggested was prosopon, literally face, a term found in the Bible no less. While this was accepted by the Greeks as the best the Latins could do, it never replaced their understanding of hypostasis. In Hebrew, face was panin and generally referred to an external presentation of God, a mode, or way, of being apprehended. Thus, to see someone face to face was to see the outward presence of an otherwise hidden reality. Face, prosopon, then, referred to the external presentation of God ad extra, which did not, of course, express God ad intra, as did the term hypostasis. To express the Trinity as God's three faces or prosopa, however, is well taken. Just as there is no triangle without its sides or faces, so too, there is no God without its triune sides, faces, or distinct modes of existence. Similar to the Greek persona, however, prosopon could also be given a modalist or Sabellian interpretation, which brought matters back to hypostasis. For the Latins, however, once they came upon persona, its Latin understanding as a property, they held on to this understanding of the Trinity. From here on, it would define the Trinity as three persons in one God, or one God in three persons. It seems it was only sometime in the 6th century the Greeks accepted the Latins persona, person, as equivalent to their term hypostasis. This, of course, was a huge mistake. Person never meant hypostasis, nor vice versa. What might be of interest today, however, is the original Greek understanding of person, persona, as a temporary role someone plays. In today's psychological context, a role or mask is a put-on that can legitimately be called a false self. Person is all on the outside, an external presentation of someone, which is not, however, his true nature. Even today, persona means some fictitious character, a role consciously put on by an actor, yet unconsciously put on by many people. While no one would admit this definition of persona, ownership, is what the Latin fathers had in mind, it is difficult to escape this same conclusion. While hypostasis was to signify God's immanent triune modes of existence, of the very essence of God, it never signified God's ownership of three persons. Unless person is of the essence of God, then a divide exists between essence and person, between the owner and the owned. Theologians do not like the notion of any divide between the essence, nature, of the Trinity and the persons of the Trinity, but there is no other way to put it. As we'll see, when speaking of the Trinity in Christ, whether the reference be to nature or person makes for a totally different understanding of the Trinity in Christ, which can be orthodox or heretical. For example, to say, Jesus Christ is God, is this a reference to Jesus' nature and or person? Or is it a reference to God's nature and or person? Is it a reference to the union of both natures and persons? Or does it reference none of these? Since it references none of these, what exactly is Jesus Christ a reference to? Watch out for your answer. Since it was obvious that something owned did not define the true nature of the owner, and that persons as mere properties only spoke of God ad extra, the Latins eventually came to recognize the importance of hypostasis. By itself, persons did not define the Trinity, because God is not the owner of a Trinity, or three persons, rather, God is Trinity. So, recognizing the need for the term hypostasis, from then on, person meant the property of each hypostasis, and not the properties of God's one essence. In other words, it is not God's essence that owned or had three properties, rather, it was each hypostasis that had its own particular property or was its own person. Later we will see how this plays out when it comes to understanding Christ. For right now, what we have is God's essence, God's hypostases, God's prosopon and God's persons, all meaning something different. If anybody wonders why the Trinity is a mystery, it is because theology made it so. Of itself, nothing is easier to understand and recognize experientially than the Trinity. Few people with any sense of spirituality could miss it. So let us be clear, God as three persons cannot and does not refer to God's essence. At best, it can only refer to properties of God's triune hypostases. In essence, God is three distinct hypostases and not, in essence, three persons. So, remember then, person does not define the owner or God. Before there can be a person, there must be someone to whom it belongs. There cannot be a person if there is no one there. So, the two terms, hypostasis, owner, and person, owned, are not synonymous or interchangeable terms. Since person has to refer to someone, some individual entity, this is fine as far as man is concerned, but unless the Trinity is three individual entities or beings, how could they be persons? Based on Aristotle's definition of individual as a numerical one, how could God be an individual? Much less three individuals. Despite this fact, however, God was held to be three persons, and hypostases redefined to refer, primarily, to autonomous individuals, little different from persons. By no stretch of linguistic subterfuge, however, does person mean hypostasis, neither etymologically nor in its original intent and usage, yet authors continuously use them as synonymous terms. All the Latin, Western, translations of the early fathers will use the term person instead of hypostasis, totally deceiving the reader. Not only did the early fathers not think in terms of person, they would never have used persona as mask with its modalistic understanding of the Trinity. So, anyone who thinks the early Greek-speaking fathers used the term person must be disabused of this notion. None of the early fathers accepted it. Western authors, of course, want to make it sound as if the early fathers all agreed with use of person. Not true at all. And while we are at it, there is a quote from Paul, "We are all one person in Christ," which Paul could never have said because the term person wasn't even coined in his time. Also, having gone over many different translations of Chalcedon and becoming familiar with the Greek writing for hypostasis and person, the term person was not used at Chalcedon, and certainly not at Nicaea. Hypostasis and prosopon are there, but not person. The very idea of God as a person is a disaster, and that God is three persons is pure tritheism. As reference to the abiding triune distinctions in God's essence, hypostases is as far as the term can legitimately go. Taking it beyond to mean three individuals, three persons, three subjects, three whos, which the mind can only grasp as three beings, there is no getting around tritheism. It is one thing to deny tritheism, but another to remove the possibility of it. As soon as God is made to be a person, the Trinity is personified, anthropomorphized as three individual beings. The term person cannot escape tritheism, the worst of all Christian heresies. If language is not honed to the truth, the result can never be the truth. Since it is not possible for the human mind to think of a person other than as a concrete embodied individual being or entity, the notion of God as three persons has to be thrown out. While promoting this kind of polytheism is wrong, the problem is, people do not recognize it as polytheism. Like the fathers, Christians would be horrified to think they were polytheists or believed in three gods. But this is why the Trinity is kept at a distance, declared a mystery incapable of the human mind to grasp. This is also why the Trinity means relatively nothing to the average Christian and plays no part in his spiritual life. To their credit, however, and despite their constantly being presented with three deities or individual persons, Father, Son, and Spirit, somehow, Christians know God is not three individual beings. To be a Christian, one has to ignore the traditional theological tritheistic presentation of the Trinity, as found in the Creed, prayers, doctrines, and so on. This is why Christians focus solely on the historical figure of Jesus, because Jesus is the only person that makes sense to them, the only person they know. And indeed, Jesus is a person, while God is no person. Though the meaning of person would change, it continued to be regarded as an incommunicable property distinguished from the individual who owned it. Thus, an individual is not a property or person, and a property or person is not the individual that owns it. While you own your own person, yet in essence, what you are is not your person, on the contrary, you are what you are minus your property or person. Thus, what you are is distinct from who you are. And not only is person to be distinguished from what you are, but to be distinguished from that you exist. In short, that you are and what you are is not who you are. Do not, then, mistake an individual for a person, they are not the same thing. Neither theologically nor philosophically were the two terms, individual and person, regarded as the same reference or used as synonymous terms. Person is premised on there first being some individual, even though individual is not a person. So here is the first problem with the term person. As it entered the world's common language understood as a property of nature, both God and man's, person does not define the nature or essence of either God or man. It does not define what God is or what man is, all it defines is what these natures possess or own. Person has been called a property, an attribute, even an accident that follows necessarily from nature. Thus, God in man's essential nature necessarily has or owns this property called person. An official rendition is this: the person must be defined as a basic principle endowed with no less intrinsic value or ontological content than nature, profoundly distinct from nature although intimately united to it. According to this, what you are and who you are is a union, but what does this union form? If it forms some entity or being, this brings us back to an individual what. But if what refers to the essence, and who to person, what exactly is this who that nature owns and is united to? Interestingly, who is said to be the soul's mover and shaker, one's own self, no less. Thus, nature owns itself, self is its own property, its own person. So, who one is, then, is his very own, self. As to how human nature, body and soul, will, mind, psyche, could be united to its own self, is either a piece of nonsense or a profound mystery. The only reason theology regards nature and person as a union is to make the case Jesus' human nature was united to the divine person of the Logos. This way, it can say Jesus was not a human person, but a divine person, God in person. Without postulating nature and person as a union, they would have no way to explain why, or how, Jesus was not his own person but was God's own person instead. So, by saying nature and person is only a union, they could disunite the two, nature and person, and substitute God for the divine person of Jesus. This way, Jesus was no longer to be regarded as a human person, but as a divine person. Now, if God, as a divine person, can be the person, or self, of man's human nature, then God can be the person, or self, of every human nature. After all, anything possible for one human being, say, Jesus, is possible for every human being. That everyone can become God in person or God's own self is, indeed, the belief of some monistic religions. So, if one wants to find out how all this works, they'd best go to India and Hinduism because it holds that one's true person or self is God. That nature is only united to person, or self, sounds as if person is some independent substance, something, that can, or cannot, be united to human nature. This, at least, is the theological notion that God's person took over for the human person of Jesus, a genuine case of divine possession. This is justified by saying God was not only the owner or person of its own divine nature, but owner or person of its human nature as well. To make this claim, of course, not only depends on the assumption God is a person, but that God as a person is not of the essence or existence of God, but only a property of God. It also assumes that God can act like a human person as well as a divine person. It is one thing for God to own its own incarnate human nature, but quite another for God to act the part of a human person. These are radically contrary views, and later we will be pointing out why this is so. For now, let us apply this divide, between essence and person, to God. Does person refer to God ad intra or only ad extra? To be told God as persons Father, Son, Spirit is not a reference to God in essence, but only to God's properties. Does this mean God as persons only refers to the economy of salvation, the economic Trinity, but not to the essence of God in itself? A true understanding of the Trinity stands or falls on the answer to this question. Are we to believe God is three persons only soteriologically, economically ad extra, but not in reality, not in essence and existence? Either person is of the very essence, nature, of God, or it is not. If essence and person is only a union, then these can be separated such that person, God's own self, is not the essence of God, nor the essence of man. This means that if person, one's own self, was eliminated, this would not change the nature, essence and existence, of either God or man. Theologically, then, since nature is not a person, and person is not nature, or essence, to be without the owned or person would not change the essence or nature of God or man. So, person, then, is not of the essence, the nature, or the abiding reality of either God or man. Who, person, you are, is not what you are, because who is not the true nature or essence of either God or man. To give some idea of the difference between Trinity as three hypostases and three persons, John Damascus, 7 sub th/sub c, gives the following explanation of person that he called hypostasis. Existence equals that something exists. Essence equals what it is that exists. Person equals who it is that exists. Hypostasis equals mode of existence. Where essence is common or universal, hypostasis refers to God's distinct triune modes of existence. Who, however, always refers to a particular individual. How a division between essence and person could be justified without making God three particular individuals or beings is inexplicable. It is a prescription for polytheism.